Hello, welcome to another Swatches video. This time I have the Natasha Denona My Dream palette for you. This is one of their 15 pan midi size palettes, and it is pretty much all neutrals. There are 8 mattes, there are 7 shimmers. So of the 8 mattes, there are 2 of them that are cream powders. Those are the shades Instinct and Edgy, and the rest are just regular powder mattes. Out of the 7 shimmers, they are a mixture of smooth, fine shimmers and some that are more sparkly. There is one of them that is a very obvious multi-chrome, and there is a second one that is more of a duochrome, but it has much more subtle shift to it. I'm going to go ahead and go through each individual swatch here and describe the color and my experience with the shades so far as I've used it. First up is Blackest Black, and it is pretty deep, but it isn't the darkest black I've ever used, so I find the name a little bit ironic. But this is swatching kind of sheer. It went on the eye much more opaque and smoother than it looks here, so for some reason it is adhering to my finger as I'm trying to swatch it and not wanting to transfer to the skin, and you're going to see that with the next shade I swatch as well. I thought this was a pretty nice black. I didn't have much fallout with it. Next is the shade Aspiration. This is also a powder matte, and it is a deep gray with kind of a purplish brownish undertone to it. It doesn't swatch very well. It's kind of patchy, and it adheres to my finger so much that it doesn't want to transfer to my arm, but it does show up well when used on the eye. This one is Serenity, and it's a smooth shimmer with all fine shimmer particles, and it has very good opacity. It went on nearly opaque in one pass here. The next one is Carpe Diem, and this is a powder matte. It is a light orangey brown, and I found this one had good even pigmentation and was easy to blend out on the eye. The next one is Babies, and this is a powder shimmer. It kind of has a waxier, more emollient feel than some of the other shimmers in the palette, and the sparkles are kind of flaky, but when you spread the color out over the skin, those flakes kind of break up into fine shimmer. So it's a little bit of a different texture than some of the other shimmers in the palette, and it goes on more sheer, requires a little bit of building. The next one is Instinct, and this is the first cream powder formula that I'm talking about in this palette. It is kind of a light wine color. It goes on the skin lighter than it looks in the pan, and it feels a little bit drier than my past experiences with this formula from Natasha Denona. It's also drier than the other cream powder in the palette, which is Edgy. The 2 colors that are this formula in the palette are very similar. This one is only slightly lighter, and I kind of wish that it was a little bit more distinct in color from that one. This one is Thrill, and I would describe this as a duochrome. It is a shifty shade, but it does, it's not very obvious. I didn't realize that it shifted the first time I used it, and it wasn't until I swatched it heavily and looked at it at different angles that I realized it was a duochrome. When you look at it straight on, it's a light pink, and from an angle it looks more gold. It isn't, I already mentioned, it's not very obvious, and this is a sparklier texture than the other shimmers. It has larger particles, and it goes on more scattered than, like, say, Serenity, which is one of those smoother shimmers, but it can be built up to be more opaque. The next one is Unity, and this is a powder matte. This is a light orange. It reminds me of the color of cantaloupe. This one, it has good pigmentation. It was easy to blend. I found this was very easy to use in the crease or as a transition shade. Very nice quality. The next one is Risk, and this is kind of like a satin shimmer. It has a matte base color, but it has plenty of shimmer in there that also shows up. So It's not as reflective as the other shimmers, and it requires a little bit more building. Also, it kind of goes on, it's got a little bit of a thicker feel to it. So I feel like I need to put on a few layers for it to show up as heavily as some of the others. The next one is Invention, and this is another sparkly shade similar in texture to Thrill. I would say this one is even more sparkly and has even larger particles. It is, I would say, more reflective, and it also has a base color, a very sheer pink base color that is visible when I swatch the shade, but when I use this on the eye, like for example on the brow bone, I don't really notice that base color. All I really get is like a sheer layer of larger sparkles. And here is the shade Vision. This is the standout shade of the palette probably. It's the one very obvious multi-chrome in here. From straight on, this looks like a medium purple, and at an angle it looks more green. It does go several shades, so it will go from purple to bronzy shade to like an olive green, and then at an extreme angle it will look like a true bright green. I would say the shift is very visible. It wasn't that difficult to capture the shift in a photo. I can see it in real life, but it isn't so distracting that I feel like it makes it difficult to apply and pair with other shades. I feel like it is very cohesive. So there are a lot of purples and golds in this palette, and I think those complement the range of colors in this shade well. It is sort of a sparklier shimmer. The particles are pretty uniform and they're pretty small, but they're not as small as the shimmers in Serenity, and they're also not as large as the sparkles in Thrill and Invention. But if I move this shade around in the light, I can see the sparkles dancing in the light more than with a smooth shimmer. It has very good opacity. It goes on nearly opaque in a single swipe. Next is Edgy, and this is the second cream powder in this palette. It is a little bit darker than the other one, which is Instinct. I thought that when I used this on the eye, it had very good color payoff. It doesn't look like it in the swatches here. It looks pretty sheer. I feel like it picked up easier on a dense brush than I was able to pick it up on my finger. And I thought it transferred pretty easily to the lid and blended out well. But it did require some building, so it's not as quick to use as the powder mattes are, but I thought that both of the cream powders in this palette were easier and faster to use than some of the cream powders I've used in her previous palettes. This one is Spontaneous, and it is a light neutral beige. It has a lot more color payoff than I was expecting. Usually shades like this are just kind of sheer, a little bit boring there, and this one is kind of like a common shade. However, I really like the color payoff of this. It's very smooth. It isn't dry at all. It adheres really well. There's hardly any fallout at all. So just a nice quality neutral. The next one is Nurture, and this is a powder matte. It's a kind of warm, light brown. It's warmer, I think, than it looks like it is in the pan. It's also darker when I use this on the eye. It's not one that I would say is the most natural looking transition shade on me. It looks pretty deep on me, and I am able to sheer it out, but I feel like the Natasha Denona's powder mattes are more heavily pigmented than a lot of other shadows that I've used, and they tend to go on the lid darker. So if you're somebody that likes highly intense color payoff, like this is probably the formula to go to, but it's not the fastest formula to work with. It requires a lot of blending if you want a lighter, more airy kind of look out of it. So it just depends on your preferences. And the last one is Familia. This is another powder matte. It's very similar in texture to Nurture. I thought it had pretty good, even color payoff and was decently easy to blend. I feel like Natasha Denona's mattes aren't the easiest to blend eyeshadows in the world, but they adhere well and they show up really well. So if you like your colors to be distinct and show up well against one another, I feel like this is a good formula for that. So here's a quick overview of all of the swatches together. I'm very happy with the overall color story of this. I feel like everything is very well balanced and well chosen. The only nitpicky thing I would say is that Instinct and Edgy are a little bit too similar, but otherwise I feel like the rest of the shades are all very well chosen. I like that there's a good ratio of mattes to shimmers, and that there's some smooth shimmers and some sparkly shimmers. I've enjoyed the looks that I've created with this palette, and looking forward to using it some more. So hopefully this was helpful, and I will see you in the next one.